they, thus far anyway, have been pretty interesting. So we'll get started in just about a minute. But in the meantime, please feel free to begin sharing any incidents, emergencies, or other events that have occurred over summer, winter, or spring break. Well, good morning, everybody, and or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. We appreciate you being with us on our Thursday School Safety Webinar Series, and can't tell you how much we appreciate those of you in particular that have been with us for a number of sessions. There are a couple of you on the line that have actually been with us for just about every session, if not every one. And so for those of you that are in that category, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And we hope and plan to continue to give you new and incredible information over the course of the next 6 months. We're excited to have this series continue, and we're excited to have each of you, both new and old, and or recurring, on the series with us. My name is Chris, and I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services. And Joffe is a company that was born with CPR and first aid training and event safety and some other components, and over the course of several years as we began to work with schools has really evolved to, frankly, a school safety team. And so we're excited to be able to present and share with you some of the things that we've encountered. Some of them tend to be incredibly challenging to discuss. Others of them tend to be far easier and more comfortable to discuss. And today's topic, preparing for winter break and preparing for emergencies that may occur over it, fall into that sort of tough to talk about category. And in large part, the reason for that is that winter break is this time where everybody's excited, everybody's thrilled that we're halfway through the year and our families are coming into town. We're rid of students for at least a week or two, most of us for 2 or longer. And so it's just this great time. And as we prepare for it and as we plan for it, one of the challenges that we have is that we still have a group of people, students, staff, faculty, families, boards, administrators that are still people and still may be doing various things, in fact are probably doing things over that time that they wouldn't normally have time or be able to do. And as a result, any number of emergencies could come up. And we actually got the idea to present this information based on a series of events that have occurred over the last several years with schools that we work with, both in Los Angeles, in the Bay Area, and in the Northeast, from DC to Boston, and actually up even into Maine. And so our goal in today's conversation, and really in all of our conversations, is to prepare you and to empower you to respond to an emergency that should occur. Well, in today's, we're specifically talking about preparing you and a group of people that you'll have to sort of curate and assemble to respond to an emergency when nobody else may be around or available. Today's conversation will have a number of scenarios and events that we've responded to. Each of them are real-life scenarios, real-life events. And there are actually a couple that we'll share with you that some other folks that are with us today have experienced and shared with us. And so if you're one of those folks that's either shared something with us already or is planning to share something with us throughout the presentation today, I'll ask that if you would prefer that we just sort of talk about the incident but not really discuss it in a lot of detail, just make sure that you include that in the comment that you post in on the right-hand side of your screen. And likewise, if you're somebody who is interested in or willing to have us discuss in detail what the event was, please feel free to share that as well. No matter what, we won't share the school name and we won't actually even share the city, but we may talk about the state or the region that it's in. And if that's related in particular, that may come up. So please feel free to share whether or not that's something you'd like us to do. With that, let's go ahead and dive in. Before we actually get started, I'd like to give you just a moment to self-reflect. And this is a question that we'll actually come back to towards the end of our conversation today. And the question is, if something were to occur over winter break, where a student, a staff member, a faculty member, or a family member of a student, staff, or faculty member was injured or had something else that was serious happen to them, how quickly would your entire community know about it through Facebook? And we're not actually going to pull this one today. I'm just going to give you a moment to sort of think about that. And I'll talk with you a little bit about each of these options. So frankly, everybody has some method of social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever else they've come up with today. Everybody's got those. And so it's logical to think that if everybody's got them and most people are connected through them, that information could spread relatively quickly. And social media is actually one of the key, in fact, it's one of the sole means of communication over winter break from family to family or from student to student. Obviously, students that are within certain peer circles have their network that they work with and communicate with on a regular basis. Obviously, parents that often exchange playdates and things like that have their network, and certainly they communicate back and forth aside from social media. But students that are in different peer groups or parents that perhaps don't often get together for any number of reasons may also be friends on their various or linked together on their various social media networks. And that allows information to spread far beyond just their own sort of sphere and into the rest of the community. And that's really the challenge that we have over winter break, spring break, summer break, and really any other time that we don't have school. In some ways, we could even look at that as a challenge over just a weekend. Now, for most of us, we think, okay, well, if something were to happen, and I realize I haven't given you a whole lot of context, but if an injury or a serious event were to occur over a weekend or over winter break, well, somebody would probably call the school. And of course, there's that question, well, who in the school would they call, and how would that person manage it, and what if that person weren't there? But they'd get a hold of someone, and that's an easy thing for us to sort of grab onto and latch onto and say, well, that probably will happen. But what we often forget is that in addition to calling the school, that they're likely to share information through their own social channels, and they're likely to allow this incident by choice or by mistake to grow into something that's much larger than just themselves and just their own community. Now, a lot of you are looking at the 20 minutes and going, how is that possible? Why would anybody share something on Facebook and within 20 minutes be able to share it with the entire community? And that sounds a little short to me too. A lot of you are thinking the same thing about the 2 hours, and I'll say that 2 hours is actually pretty close to right on, and we'll talk about a specific scenario in just a moment, where 2 hours is, as I said, not very far from realistic. 24 hours, believe it or not, within 24 hours, if it's an event of any magnitude, the entire community knows, and it's likely that members of other local communities know too. So put differently, if you're a school that's up in, let's say, Oakland, California, and an event occurs that impacts your community, within the first 2 hours, the bulk of your community typically becomes aware of it, 3 hours or so. And within 24 hours, not only is your community aware of it, but so is the community next door. So is the community across the river, the bridge, the bay, whatever that may be in your area. And within 2 weeks, not only has it been talked about, not only are people aware of it, but opinions have been formed. And winter break is traditionally somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks, and for each school that may be a little bit different. But 2 weeks tends to be the average. And within 2 weeks, certainly it's discussed among the community. The information is shared among the community, and then an opinion or a stance or a response is often formed. And that's what becomes dangerous for the school from a PR and a management perspective. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Our goals by the end of the webinar are to ensure that you're able to articulate the beginning of a crisis communications team. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, what that looks like, how it works, who should be on it, and things like that. We'll hope that and plan that you're able by the end of the webinar to at least understand how to leverage your emergency notification system for more than just those texts or emails that we've talked about throughout the series thus far. So all of you hopefully are using your emergency notification system now to announce a lockdown, and you're doing it by text message and phone call and email. And hopefully you're doing that to not only your staff and faculty, but your students too, maybe even your parent community, depending on the type of school that you're working in. Well, a lot of you are probably not thinking about your emergency notification system yet as a PR tool, and that's really what we're going to talk about today within that category. Next, we'll hope that you're able to identify 6 people within your community to identify, utilize, and ensure that can be empowered and accessible over breaks, and that they can be quickly activated and quickly utilized if something goes wrong. Put differently, it's not enough to say, well, they'll get a hold of somebody. We need to really identify 6 people, at least within the staff and faculty group, that we say, if you find something out that you feel like needs to be communicated, you get on the phone with one of these 6 people. And then we've got to take that a step further and make sure that those 6 people actually know what to do with that information. And then finally, you'll identify the need and or not of an external crisis communications team or an external PR team, depending on the school environment, depending on all of the variables and factors that we'll discuss today. You may or may not be a school who says, you know what, we absolutely need an external source to help us and support us. And that may be from a crisis perspective and a management perspective, or maybe from a communications and PR perspective. And so we'll talk through each of those options, what they typically look like, and even provide some resources for you on those. So let's put this into context. Winter break typically, again, is somewhere around 2 weeks, and theoretically there are no students on campus. For some of you, you actually close your campuses and you say not only should there not be any students on campus, but we're not letting any students on campus. There are very few, if any, faculty and staff on campus, and again, for some of you, you actually close campus and say no, nobody can come. What I've found over the last several years is that the bulk of our schools are closing school from, say, Christmas Eve or a couple of days before that through New Year's Day or maybe a couple of days after that. And for that period of time, there's absolutely nobody on campus, period. Then another, or rather through the other times, whether it's a week before or a week after, there's some movement, some activity that occurs on campus, maybe even some school-sponsored activities that actually have some participation. But whether or not there are a couple of folks on campus, they're obviously student-free, and for a lot of you, that means staff and faculty-free too. Now, the other part about winter break is that you and I and most folks get to run home or run to our spouse's home or run to somewhere else in the country, or sometimes not even, and spend that time with family and friends and things like that. And of course, that's holiday related, and that tends to be a winter break thing, although certainly spring break invites trips and all sorts of activity, as does summer. And so each of those different times of the year tend to warrant different places that people may go. Oftentimes we see international travel happen over summer as opposed to over winter, but frankly it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're not in our immediate area or our normal area, and therefore our response to issues like these can be much more challenging to start and much more challenging to actually stay engaged with. So put differently, if I'm normally in Boston and that's where I work, that's where I teach, and that's what I normally do, and now all of a sudden I'm in Seattle and I didn't bring my laptop because it was just a family trip, and so all I've got for technology and communication is my phone, that's a very different type of response that I can actually engage in and participate in, support, or even manage than it would be if I were just sitting at home. Also over winter break, we have 2 of the most challenging events for a safety consultant to help support. We have the holidays, which are a time where families come together, and for good and for otherwise, they're together and communicating, and some of them enjoy each other's company and some of them perhaps not so much. And so that certainly causes some challenges. And then we have New Year's Eve, which still today is one of the most difficult days, both Eve and New Year's Day, to manage from a police and criminal activity perspective. And by and large, the biggest challenge is frankly just drunk driving and people that aren't thinking about what the consequences of their actions are. And unfortunately, and we'll talk through one of these scenarios that does involve that, not with an adult, but with a student. And those are the types of events that can be incredibly difficult to manage from a PR and a communication standpoint, and even more so when we don't have the resources in place that we normally do. So, as if I haven't articulated this already, what's the problem? Well, if we've got an emergency that occurs over winter break when we don't have access to all of the people that we typically do, it's hard to manage. And so we sort of hold true or attempt to latch on to this idea that people will call and people will email, and so somebody will certainly see it. And sometimes that certainly does work, and other times it doesn't. So I'll share with you a scenario, and this is actually not a true scenario. This is just a fun one. And, well, perhaps not fun, but not true anyway. And so the scenario that I'll share with you is that Timmy Jones, and Timmy Jones is hopefully not a real student in any of your schools, comes home, or rather is home for the holidays, and his family comes in as well. And when his family comes in, things tend to get a little bit dicey and things tend to get kind of uncomfortable because he's just not particularly comfortable with that. Well, that comes from his parents because there's some long-lost issues that exist with the family. You know where I'm going with this. Well, this fight starts, and it upsets Timmy, and it upsets Mom, and Timmy decides he just doesn't want to be at home anymore. By the way, Timmy's 12 years old. Timmy runs away. And that happens at about 6 o'clock one evening. Let's call it Tuesday evening. And Mom can't find him. It's 7 o'clock now. She's starting to get worried. She starts calling friends. Where did he go? He hasn't come back yet. This isn't like him. Perhaps she even has called the police. That all started at 6 o'clock that evening. Now we'll take a quick pause from that scenario for just a moment to share that the average person, and this is always an interesting one because we all have different perspectives and we all interact differently with social media. But in the US, the average person lists what's considered a general issue within 4 hours on Facebook. The average person has somewhere around 300 friends on Facebook, and if you have less friends, don't worry, so do I. But on average, people have about 300 friends. And with that group of 300 friends and with that time lapse of less than 4 hours, the average person can spread a very volatile message, or one that a lot of people are interested in or upset by or emotionally impacted by, to rather 500,000 people within about 3 hours. So to put that into a timeline, Timmy ran away at 6 o'clock on Tuesday night. By 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning, about 1 million people are aware that he's missing. And the challenge is that the school hasn't done anything about it. Now, in this particular case, whether or not the school identifies or feels a need to respond, the school may or may not have any sort of PR repercussions or consequences as a result. In other cases, though, and we'll talk about some of those, the school has a very clear perceived need to respond, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment as well. And so this 14-hour gap that's occurred between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning, when all of the rest of the world has been informed and aware, it can be really detrimental to the overall outcome of this situation. And again, the challenge, and one of the things that we look at within the crisis communications model, is that it's not just the actual facts of the case that matter. It's the perception and the reaction and the people that were involved, the words that are said, and oftentimes those things take a lot of time to create and to manage, even on a good day when everybody's present. So I often ask the question, well, who cares? If the school didn't respond and the school didn't have a need to respond, who cares? Well, nobody. On the flip side, if the school didn't respond and the school has a perceived need to respond, then everybody. And oftentimes that can lead to a number of different issues. Most sort of generally, they're issues between administrators, issues that are sort of looking back going, well, why didn't we respond? Who didn't respond? Whose fault is this? Who's accountable for this? And those questions can be hard to answer and lead to some really difficult decisions oftentimes made by the school. So the term PR is often used as public relations, and that's probably how you know it. And I've modified that for today's conversation and frankly for my everyday life as perceived reputation. Because really what we're doing when we do PR work from a crisis standpoint is we're modifying or we're shifting or we're shaping or we're creating the response and the reputation that we want the world to see or we want our community to see, depending on how large the event was. And when we do this, there are a couple of things that are incredibly important. The first is timeliness, so ensuring that we get a message out as quickly as possible, and if at all possible, we actually beat the social media issue or beat that issue going viral. and we get our communication out first, and that allows us to shape the perception of what's going on. If that doesn't work, then at least we engage with it or we engage in it, and so we actually try to use it and leverage it to help shape the story that we want the world to hear and see and be a part of. There are a couple of scenarios that I'll share with you, and the first one is probably the most difficult. And this happened in 2014, so it's been just over a year, no, just over almost 2 years now. It was New Year's Eve of 2014, and long story short, a group of teenagers, they were all juniors and seniors in high school, went out and went to a party. They had some drinks at that party. They had some drugs at that party. They decided that the best thing that they could do was to actually be home on time for curfew, which for them was 2:30. And so they jumped in the car and they drove home. The driver was not a designated driver. The driver was actually perhaps the most inebriated of them all. And the driver got into an accident on the freeway, and every person that was in that car was hospitalized, and all of them with pretty serious injuries. By about 2 o'clock on New Year's Day, the entire school community had gotten together and said, why was this allowed? Because it was at another student's home that this party had taken place. Well, by about 5 o'clock that afternoon, it came out that the parents of that other student were at the home. And so there was an immediate response from the community to be angry with the parent that allowed it to happen, and angry with the student that was driving, and angry with all of the students that were in the car. And frankly, in crisis communications, we don't have the ability to ask whether that anger is justified or not, but we have to ask this more challenging question. Well, what can the school do about it? How can the school help and support this incident? How can the school make a safe environment for not only the rest of the students, but for the group of students that was in this car, and for the student that held the party? And our goal, obviously, is not, again, to establish right, wrong, or otherwise, but to create that safe environment for every single person that's there, or create an environment where those people are no longer welcome. So put differently, if we decide that we want to kick those students out of school, that's our prerogative, and then we need to communicate that and manage it that way. If we decide that we want those students to come back to school for one reason or another, we need to be able to communicate in a way that allows them to come back safely and without fear of retaliation or, frankly, anything else. I'll talk with you a little bit more about the strategy that was employed for that particular incident and some of the things that could have gone better. There was another one, perhaps the next worst, if I can say those words that way, also in 2014, and it was a Christmas Eve party, and there was a group of staff and faculty members that were present, and there were about 15 of them that all came together. It was not at any of their homes or places. It was somebody else's party, and they had just coincidentally all been invited. They decided to carpool, and the driver of the vehicle actually was a designated driver, wasn't drinking anything. And on the drive home, somebody else who was a drunk driver actually hit that vehicle, and it ended up just the same, putting 2 of the 4 passengers in that vehicle into the hospital with some pretty serious injuries. And again, by about midday on Christmas Day, the entire school community had no reason to believe that the driver wasn't inebriated. So put differently, the entire community took the information that they had, which was that there was an accident that had occurred and that alcohol may have been involved. Well, they made the assumption that that meant the driver, and everybody knew who the driver was because that was published. And so by the time that teacher came back to school after winter break, that teacher was actually asked to leave because the information had taken on a life of its own, the communication had taken on a life of its own, and it actually pushed that teacher out, made it so that it wasn't safe for that teacher to be there anymore, and the administration didn't have the ability to even ask the question, well, was there alcohol involved for you or not? And again, right, wrong, or in between doesn't necessarily make a big difference. What I found really fascinating about that was that the power of the communication that had occurred on social media and through private channels that didn't involve the school at all far overrode the power that the school had once all of that information got to it. So there frankly wasn't any choice for the business office or the head of school but to make the decision that they did. Another story that I'll share with you is a New Year's Day event This was a football game, and this was actually one that was in Southern California. And long story short, there were a group of about 15 students, 15 to 20 students that went to the Rose Bowl. And for those of you that don't know, the Rose Bowl is a great big football game that always happens on New Year's Day. Beyond that, I'm not exactly sure what else goes on there. Long story short, though, they were there, and there was an event that occurred, and it was actually a confrontation that occurred between two teams. And the students that were there were actually trying to get out of the stadium when the confrontation started and couldn't, and so there was a small brawl, and I suppose small is sort of relative, but it was about 40 people that were involved, and it wasn't a particularly serious brawl, but it ended up that the students that were trying to leave all from one school were sort of being pushed against students from another local school. And there weren't a whole lot of those students. There were only about 4 of those students from the other school. And it created this sort of school rivalry that, again, before anybody got back from winter break, had created and taken on a life of its own, and had actually started to sort of create a tension that could have been managed with some more expedient communication. And then finally, and this was also in 2014, if you're seeing the trend here, 2014 was a rough year. The worst possible scenario is when there is an administrator involved. And in 2014, there was an administrator involved in a drunk driving incident that also involved some students and some other issues that went on. So there were a number of issues that happened. And again, and this perhaps is the most challenging of them all, the administrator that was involved was the person that was responsible for the crisis communications. And they weren't able to be objective and or even present for the conversations that took place around the response and what the school was going to do about it. And so I share that particular story with you for 2 reasons. And the first is that these events can happen over winter break, over spring break, over any other time, and they do. And it's important that there are at least a couple of folks that can help respond to those emergencies, and again, not necessarily running out to try and fix the actual problem, but get out ahead of the communication and the other problems that can sort of coexist with an event like this. And in this case, the one person who had been assigned to be present for that and to help manage that situation and articulate sort of what the next steps were for the organization was the person that was involved. And again, obviously that doesn't work. So what do I do about this? How can we actually make this sort of work for us? How can we prevent these emergencies that occur off campus or at off-campus related sponsored activities, still school-sponsored activities, from becoming giant on-campus emergencies that potentially prevent students from being able to come back to school the following day? The first, and as any of our webinars has gone, the first step is preparedness. So ensuring that you're actually able to sort of create a plan in advance and ensuring that you're able to actually execute that plan. And frankly, you should really be drilling and testing that plan to make sure that it works and make sure that it works with various different scenarios. For the school where the administrator was involved that I spoke about just a moment ago, the plan was that that person would deal with it, and anybody else that was informed would call that person, and that person would create a message and send it out, and problem solved. But obviously that plan didn't work. So as you start to test this plan and as you start to form drills and create some conversation around this plan, I would suggest that you try to actually pull out some of the people, some of the systems, some of the options that you may have, and see if the plan still works. So put differently, if you create a team of 4 people and you say, all right, well, 3 of them happen to all go to NAIS at the same time, or the whole business office that's responsible for this all leaves and goes to NBO in February at the same time, well, now does this still work, or does that leave us with just 1 person available? Just the same, if your senior admin team or your leadership team or whatever that team is for you that helps to lead and run the school goes on a retreat at any point during the year, well, did I just take away all of the people and all of the systems and all of the knowledge that I need in order to respond to an emergency? Well, does that retreat occur over a break and over a time where we might have to respond to something off campus? Then probably. Did that retreat or did that trip or whatever it is take place over a time where students were actually present and could have an emergency on campus? Well, then probably. You've just basically taken away all of the resources that you've worked so hard to create. So ensure that you actually test and figure out whether or not your plan works. But before you can test it, obviously we need to have a plan in place. So first things first, who do you need? In general, I like to have the head of school. I like to have the communications person, whoever that is. I like to have the business office, and then I like to have the person who I call the safety lead. So inevitably on campus, there's somebody that sort of spearheads and manages the safety process. And for some of you, maybe that's you. For others of you, that might be your nurse. For others of you, that might be your business office or your head of school or your communications person or a teacher or anybody else for that matter. But if it's somebody that is not the head, the communications person, or somebody from the business office that sort of takes on and tackles safety needs that happen throughout the year, then that person should be there too. And if you're a relatively small school and 4 people feels like it's large enough to make your team work, then that's fine. If you're a larger school or you have a really either aggressive or involved board and you feel like a board member should be there too, maybe the board chair, maybe somebody else, then that's fine. If you're a school that has divisions broken up, then oftentimes the division heads should be there. So elementary school, middle school, and high school, or even if there's an ECC, those division heads should be there because they're likely to know a little bit more about each of the families and some of the repercussions that may occur after the emergency and after the communications. If you've got deans, they might be good people to involve, especially as we're planning for winter break, because more often than not, the issues and the incidents that occur over winter break are student behavior related. And so oftentimes your deans are going to be the best people to help sort of assess the risk. Believe it or not, sort of think in advance, well, what do I know about the social culture this year? What do I know about the groups that are getting together? How can I proactively try to prevent some of those emergencies? And then what will we do about it when they happen? And unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all, so I can't say you will always want those 4 people, your head, your communications person, your business office, and your safety lead. I can't say that your deans in every situation will make a lot of sense. But what I can say is that these problems tend to shift as students get older. So at the ECC level, at a really, really young student level, you tend to have problems that are related to illness and injury more than you do drunk driving. I should hope that 4-year-olds aren't driving anything except for big wheels. And so your problems are going to be a little bit more focused and a little bit more sort of manageable when it comes to communication. So it's much easier to say there was an injury that occurred or there's an illness that was diagnosed or any of those things and sort of articulate that and let that be fact of the matter. And those tend to be situations where people come pouring out with support. And so if we can help to craft a message that says, hey world, we need some support, or this family needs some support, and here are some ways that you can provide that, then you've done some really good work for that family or for that student. In elementary school, the same things tend to occur, although oftentimes, and I don't know that this is related to age as much as it is just the last couple of years and some of the things that we've seen, but we tend to see more things in elementary school with parents and families than we do with kids. And so it'll be issues where perhaps there was a family split, or perhaps there was a change in where the child is living or things like that. And more often than not, those are things that don't need to be communicated. Now, that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card if you're in elementary school only. It's just a note or an anecdote based on experience that, in general, elementary school tends to be a little bit easier to crisis communicate to because there are a few less crises that do actually occur. Middle school and high school start to be where those challenges start to become student-based and behavior-based. And so, again, those are the areas where I would start to engage your deans and start to engage other faculty members that may be more in the know about the social culture and what's actually going on campus. And so whether you're engaging just a couple of folks because it's an ECC and you know what you're doing and you feel pretty confident, or you're engaging a whole lot of people because you have an ECC all the way through 12th grade, make sure that you're selecting your team, you're notifying the people that you would like on the team, and then you're asking them if they're willing to participate. Because one of the other challenges that I find a lot is that we create these plans and we create these sort of programs and ideas, and then we forget to tell people that they're actually part of them. And my favorite actually happened about a year ago where we created this org chart, and it was for a school, actually I think it was in New York. And the school came to me and said, here's this org chart of all of the people that are going to be on my search and rescue team, my first aid team, my reunification team, my rover team. We're ready to go. And I said, great. And then we did our first drill, and it turned out that the search and rescue team had no idea that they were supposed to search and rescue, or that they had even been selected, or that the search and rescue team existed. And so it's imperative that although you've picked your team and you've picked hopefully good folks for your team, that you actually go through and communicate to them that they're going to be able to respond to this, they're aware of the fact that they're on this team, and that they're participating. Then the next thing you need to do, once you select that team, is to build some communication. So bring the team together and identify your student population and say, well, what are some of the things that could go wrong? What are some things that could happen over winter break, spring break, any other time? Well, if I'm an ECC and I say, well, here are some things. We could end up with a measles outbreak. We could end up with some other type of incident, hand, foot, and mouth, or anything else. We'll create those communications, and almost all of you have a life letter already. So start there. If you're not an expert crisis communicator and you're not exactly sure what you should be putting together, start with that. And in general, you should be saying, who am I communicating to? What happened? What is the school doing about it? And how can I get more information, or how can I access support or give support if that's appropriate? So what was the thing that occurred? Why are we communicating? Who's getting this information? And then how can I actually participate and engage in some type of activity around this? I would create at least 3 different communications, and I would base those 3 on the 3 most likely scenarios to occur within your school. So you'll engage that group, have everybody sit down, go around in a circle, say what are some things that could occur. One person writes down everything that could happen, and then you go back through and you prioritize them. Well, based on the age group that we've got, based on the students that we have, based on the area that we're in, here are some of the things that could occur. All right, well, here are the things we think are most likely to occur, and finally, here are the 3 that we're going to write about. Create those communications, and then put them off to the side in a Google Drive document, put them off in some document that anybody can access that's part of that team, so that they actually are usable templates, but sort of set them aside for a moment. And then start thinking about what lists. So your communications person is probably the best person to talk to about this one, and I can tell you from experience that lists are a nightmare. But identify what lists you're actually going to send this through, and then what system you're going to use. So I've got this great template communication that says, hey, this is what happened, this is what we're doing about it, this is where you can go for help, support, and resources, and to learn more, and it's awesome. But it doesn't do me any good unless I can actually get it into the hands of our community. So email tends to be the best, although some of your communities don't tend to respond well to email. So you may have to do a direct mail piece where you actually are literally crafting letters and dropping them in the mail. Or if you've got an emergency notification system that allows it, you might be able to have your head or your communications person record a message and then have the system call out. Now, I'll derail for just a moment and share that we talk about emergency notification systems the most when it comes to lockdown and earthquake and our large-scale regional emergencies. But oftentimes after those emergencies are over, after the lockdown has occurred, everybody is evacuated and been accounted for, after everything is safe, done, complete, and over, it's nice to have your head of school or somebody who's in a leadership position pre-record a message, and that message should, again, say pretty much the same thing. What happened? What are we doing about it? How can I access or get support or give support, depending on what is the most appropriate for the situation? And then how can I get more information? And so that can be a recorded message over the course of about 45 or 60 seconds. And that message can make such an incredible and impactful difference in how the community responds. And it can create a more resilient community after the fact. I can't explain the value of that type of communication, that type of message. We work with a number of different school districts and small school organizations, even charters and things like that, where oftentimes the feeling is that those messages are perhaps too much, or they're coming out too frequently because there's so many communications from the school and then from the overseeing or overarching organization, the school and the district, or vice versa. And oftentimes I say, let's just do it anyway. Come on, let's just do it. And once I can talk the group into it, they do it. And then it becomes part of their normal routine. So after anything, any event, small or large, they actually share that message that way. So Jumping back into the crisis communications piece, and again, we're not dealing with our own emergency at this point. We're helping to shape and shift and manage an emergency that occurred within the community. Well, we do the same thing. So we can actually have our head of school, our communications person, or anybody else record a message that says, hey, here's what happened, and here's what we're doing about it, and here's how you can get some support and access to resources, and here's how we give support if you need that. And ultimately, here are the next steps. So we're all going to come back to school on Monday when we're all going to figure out how to move on from here. And we're so sorry to be having this conversation, or express some type of remorse or emotion within that communication. Now, speaking of coming back to school on Monday, all school meetings are interesting. And I have had a number of times, a number of different incidents where all school meetings feel in the moment like an incredible solution. So after a lockdown or after an earthquake or after a storm has hit, we say, you know what, I think it's probably time to bring everybody together and say, hey, here's what happened. And this is actually in here more as a sort of reminder or some new information. But the way that I typically like to structure these, especially when the situation truly warrants it, and so some situations that I like to think generally would truly warrant an all-school meeting are a really serious injury or illness where the family has actually said, yes, we want you to share this, we want support, we want help. Not one where the family has said, no, please don't tell anybody, because now we're actually breaching confidentiality and a whole series of other things. But if the family has actually said, yes, we could use the support, or if you're a religious organization that's tied to a school and it's part of your community culture to share and to provide support, well, then all school meetings can be great for serious injuries or even fatalities. The next is criminal activity, and it really depends on how big the criminal activity is. It sounds silly, but I don't necessarily feel like an all-school meeting is ever appropriate if somebody steals a watch. But if somebody is convicted of a DUI, especially if it's somebody in the senior admin area, well, that's probably something that's worthy of bringing everybody together to talk about. And again, different communities may react to these things differently, and that's entirely expected, anticipated, and appropriate. But those are some of the types of criminal activities that might actually warrant an all-school meeting. Any really administration-related incident, big, small, or in between. And then finally, if there's going to be a delay in school resumption, if there was an emergency that was so big that we're not going to be able to bring everybody back to school on time or in the way that we normally would. And the delay of school resumption tends to be things that are associated with crime scenes on campus, so post-lockdown, post anything else for that matter. And the delay there is generally going to be anywhere from 1 day to a week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks. If it's beyond a week or so, we really need to be thinking about how to resume school in another location or with another mechanism. And so that's where that business continuity comes in, and we start to think, okay, well, if our school is not accessible because it's a crime scene or because there was a really bad earthquake or because of any number of different things, maybe a freeway fell next door, well, then now where are we going to go to school? And again, that delay really should not exceed a week, and if it has, then it probably means that we don't have an effective continuity plan in place. That said, in any of these situations or any other where you feel like an all-school meeting is appropriate, what I typically like to do is do an all-school meeting where parents and students come together first. And frankly, I'll back up even a step further. If this is an incident that truly warrants an all-school meeting, we should probably be talking to staff and faculty first. So the flow of this is we become aware of information, we communicate it out, we communicate as much information out as we can and or is appropriate. We get our senior team together or our communications team together or whatever that group is that we've identified as responsible for the crisis communications plan. They come up with a plan. They either engage somebody to help support them or they figure it out on their own. They come up with that plan. Well, then that should really get shared with staff and faculty, and typically that's done by email the day of or just as soon as possible. But then there's that next step of, all right, staff and faculty now are back at school. So we'll use the DUI crash of 2014 to sort of articulate this. But basically, in this case, it was December 31st. The school was coming back in session the following Monday. I believe it was Monday the 3rd. And so there wasn't a whole lot of time that was going to lapse between the incident and the time everybody got back to school. But we were well aware that the entire community was aware of it because we were getting calls from everybody. And so we communicated to staff and faculty, and we did that by email, and then we actually offered a conference call that we made available so that they could ask questions and things like that. And we had about 70% of the staff and faculty that joined that conference call on a Saturday afternoon. It was pretty incredible. And they asked great questions like, what can we do to support, and how can we help confront other students, and how can we help sort of manage expectations, and what's happening with the kids that were injured? Are they going to be okay? Are they coming back to school? What are we doing about it as a school? So it was a great opportunity for them. And that really provided them the ability to ask questions, but not us to be able to provide answers, or not answers rather, but directions, and true sort of directives about next steps and things like that. And so what we did was on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, have all of the staff and faculty come together and talk with them about how to empower students and how we wanted them to interact with students throughout the day and thereafter. We talked with them about helping to identify students that perhaps needed to see a crisis counselor, or somebody who perhaps had some PTSD either because they were at the party or because they just became aware of the situation and were afraid. And so having them sort of enlisted as part of the psychological treatment team was a great sort of benefit of that meeting. And then we said to them, here's what our plan is for the day. So right now, it's 8 o'clock, but at 9 o'clock, we're bringing all parents, all students, all families all together to talk a little bit about what happened. And then we did that, and we talked with parents, we talked with students, and the primary focus was how can we help these kids get better? What are we doing about it as a school? And by the way, here's a reminder that it's important to make sure that nobody's drinking and driving. And so you have this very empowering message that goes out and helps to control the energy that the rest of the day would have. And then we broke parents and students apart. And so at 9:40, I think it was that morning, we had students in one room, we had parents in another room, and we talked through a little bit more age appropriately some of the events that had occurred and what our true next steps were going to be. We allowed students to create cards, we allowed parents and families to do donations, and we talked with parents and families about how to identify and proactively prevent the drunk driving issue that had occurred just this very time. And so again, that's not to say that that script will work every time, or frankly that that script will even ever work again. But that was the most appropriate plan for that community, and that plan was developed by the dean, the head of school, and about 7 other people that were part of the team, including the board in that case. And it felt right for the community, and it ended up being a really positive and having a really positive impact on the community. So to recap that, I would say all school meetings tend to be great if they're truly warranted. And if they are truly warranted, they should probably be at least 3 phases, one with just staff and faculty, one with students and parents, and then one with just students. But it can be even more impactful, especially if it, again, truly warrants it, to have staff and faculty, students, and parents, and then break apart students and parents. So it's actually sort of a 4-phased approach. And depending on how severe the situation is, it may warrant a follow-up meeting as well, or some follow-up options as well. In this particular case, it didn't, although had the meeting been more challenging, perhaps we would have even decided to do that day. So again, all school meetings, great if they're warranted. Make sure that you're using age-appropriate language, and make sure that you remember that although you're talking to both students and parents, that students are still in the room, and so the communication has to be appropriate for them and has to be meaningful for them. So I talked in that scenario about assembling the team, and I said, well, we had these 7 people, and it included a board member. And oftentimes when we think about assembling the team, we forget about some of the technology that 2015 has made available to us, and 2016 soon enough. So conference calls are a really quick, easy, and generally very cheap way to assemble the team. There's actually a site called freeconferencecall.com. You can purchase a conference call for free. I guess you're not really purchasing it. And it allows you to get onto a conference call. I think you hear some ads or something. And that actually allows you to participate in a conference call in a matter of moments. You can arrange a conference call on an iPhone or on an Android device. And frankly, you can arrange them on most home phones too. So conference calls can be generally pretty easy to set up. And they allow you to obviously have people in different areas on the same line. Video meetings tend to be either a little bit more expensive or a little bit choppier. So there are tools like Google Hangouts that tend to be a little bit choppy and kind of hard to communicate on, or you can purchase tools like Skype and RingCentral and various other video conference tools, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, and you can have those conversations that way. And again, if you're a school that has the budget for it and feels like seeing everybody face-to-face would be helpful, then that's certainly a mechanism to utilize. The benefit to video meetings is that if you're overseas anywhere, that there's generally not any impact on your cell phone plan because they're Wi-Fi based as opposed to cell phone based. In person. So oftentimes we forget that it is truly possible to just reassemble everybody in person. And if the situation warrants it, that's definitely a way to assemble the team. And finally, email. And email is one of the most challenging ways to assemble the team, but it certainly still is one. And typically what I see happen there is that schools will start an email thread and they will get to the point where those 7 people or those 4 people or whatever that team is that needs to be there is on the email thread. And the challenge that I often see is that crises move really, really quickly. And so email tends to move quickly too, but it's easy for things to get lost in translation. And so if in the first 2 hours we become aware of something, it's very possible that more than 100 emails circulate before the 3rd hour hits. And it's just difficult to keep track of that. So if you're going to use that system, my recommendation is that you appoint somebody as almost a scribe and have them actually monitor every single email that comes through and keep a running list of tasks and who's responsible for what and who's done what and what our end goals are. And then with anybody, just like you would in a command center, when the team is together and through whatever mechanism they use, about every 15 minutes, you should take a second and recap where you are and where you want to go. So what has happened and what do I actually want to do about this? Why are we all here? Why are we all gathered and what's gone on? And what's our end goal? How can we ultimately make this successful and positive and comfortable for all of our students to come back to school, which generally is our end goal one way or the other. So with that, I've got some next steps for you, and in general, I've gotten some funny and great feedback about the webinars, and what I've found is that for some of you, you hear my voice and you hear that I'm going to be the lead, and you say, oh, that means I've got some homework, and so certainly today you do. And there are a couple of next steps that I would suggest that you take, and I'd suggest that you take them quickly. The first is to figure out who's on your team. Who do you feel like you want and need on that team? If you need your head of school's permission in order to gather that team, then get that, and get that quickly. If you need your communication or your PR consultant's permission to do so, then get that. But start to assemble that team, start to do so quickly, and make sure that by the time that we get to winter break that you have that team assembled and that you've actually at least sat down once, best case sat down, worst case exchanged some emails, and that you've got a plan. Decide how you're going to convene. So is it a conference call? Is it Skype? Is it Google Hangouts? Is it meeting back at a certain point? Is it everybody jumping on a plane and going somewhere else? Is it at the head's house? Where is it that you're all going to meet? How are we going to do that? And through what channels are we going to use? Draft those 3 messages for varying emergencies that may occur over winter break. And again, for now, I would keep it focused on winter break, and I would add a note to your calendar. As soon as winter break is over, knock on wood, we don't need to use any of this. Start to then evangelize it or grow it so that it's more appropriate for spring break. And then as soon as spring break is over, allow the same thing to occur for summer break, and so on and so forth. Then collaborate on vacation schedules. So the worst possible thing that can happen is that we have this team assembled, and then all of a sudden the whole team's out of the country or out of town, or they decide to take an unplugged vacation. Make sure that at the very least that you have a mechanism for activating the team or the key members of the team. So I, for example, go each year on a sort of retreat, and I don't bring my cell phone or my laptop or any technology, which is an incredible issue for me. And I spend 3 days in Sedona, which is in Arizona, and I don't bring any of this stuff, so I literally can't be reached. And I know that. But I create this plan where, working with somebody down in the town, they drive up to the cabin that I stay in, and they say, hey, there's an emergency. And I have everybody that needs to know, everybody that for whom I'm on a crisis communications team, knows the phone number for this person who runs up to the cabin that I'm in and says, hey, come down, there's an emergency. Now, that's a little complex, but then again, I'm on probably 200 crisis communications teams, so the systems don't necessarily need to be quite that complex. Maybe it's a matter of giving out your personal phone number to 1 or 2 people so that everybody else can call them and have them call you. Maybe it's giving a spouse's phone number to somebody, or giving the house phone number to the home that you'll be staying in. Any number of different solutions work for that, but just make sure that even if your goal is to be unplugged, that if you're a necessary part of that team, or just the same if somebody else's goal is to be unplugged and they're a necessary part of that team, that there's some method of getting you plugged back in, or just the same them. With that, I'd like to remind you towards the end of this conversation, as I tend to in each, that we are part of the crisis communications teams as well as part of the overall emergency preparedness and response teams for hundreds of schools nationwide. And the work that we do truly does run from immunizations to seizures. I mean, we manage individual events just related to one student all the way up to these larger scale events impacting an entire community. And so we will share with you for, essentially as an appreciation token for your participation in today's conversation, as well as the entire series, that this links for a school safety assessment. And basically what happens here is that we'll come out to your school, we'll walk around campus with you, we'll ask you some questions and make sure that those questions are answered, and we'll help build for you a plan and a set of next steps that help you understand where you need to go from a safety perspective. There's no cost to it whatsoever, and in general it can be scheduled in less than a week. So the assessment typically lasts about 90 minutes or so. If you're interested in that, please go ahead and click the link, and it looks like we just chatted that out to you. So go ahead and click that link, fill out the form, and somebody from our team will get in touch with you probably today or tomorrow. And again, that can be scheduled before Thanksgiving break, much less winter break, if your real concern is related to winter break in some of our conversation today. Again, though, the assessment's not just focused on your crisis communications plan, and so certainly it'll be much more broad. We'll help you evaluate your drill program, the emergency supplies you have on campus, and so much more. So with that, as we get ready to wrap up, I'll share with you that you're welcome to send any questions that you may have at any point today or into the future to schools@joffeemergencyservices.com. We've begun to get probably, I couldn't even put a number on it, questions a week that have obviously come from participants in this webinar series, and we're so grateful for those questions as they help us continue to improve the webinar series and make sure that we're giving you information that you want and need, and also help us understand who's out there and what your sort of unique challenges are on campus. And so please do continue to share those with us, and you can just email those again into schools@joffeemergencyservices.com. And finally, if you're not already signed up for the entire series, go ahead and click the link on your screen, or the link that we'll chat out with or for you in the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and that'll have for you the entire series. And so it'll allow you to get signed up and make sure that you're part of each webinar that we do and that you can learn from each of these conversations that we have. With that, it looks like there are a couple of questions that are in the queue, and it looks like they're all labeled for some follow-up. It doesn't look like there are very many that are for today or sort of public questions. I do see a hand raised, though. And Catherine, it looks like I see your hand raised. If you could go ahead and share your question with us in the question box on the right-hand side of the screen, we'll definitely make sure that we answer it for you before we end the presentation today. Let's see. And I tell you what, it looks like we may be having some technical difficulties getting the questions in. So what we'll do is we'll download those questions out as soon as we're done with the webinar, and then we'll reach out to those of you that had them and make sure that we answer them for you. And we'll also answer any of the really important ones and those that the entire audience will want to hear next Thursday morning, about 10 minutes before we start the webinar. So at about 9:50 Pacific or 12:50 Eastern, we'll go ahead and share with you any of the really big questions and answers that came up after today's conversation. So again, thank you so much for being on the series with us. For those of you that have been on since the beginning and are intending to stay on since the end, thanks to you especially. But to even those of you who are just on for the first time and maybe even the only, thanks so much for being with us today. We hope that you're able to bring the information that we talked about today back to your schools and help prepare and empower your entire community, staff, faculty, and student, to be prepared and more resilient in any emergency that could happen. And again, whether that's on winter break or tomorrow, our goal is that you're able to help quickly manage and communicate and powerfully resolve any emergency that should occur. And so with that, I'll say thank you so much for being with us today, and we can't wait to see you next Thursday. Have a great rest of your week and a great weekend.